2,000 years later. 6.5 hours later. A few inches later. Day 3. Day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later.
2 minutes later.
3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later. 4 to 6 more days later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually, the very next evening, 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later, 2 hours later. Meanwhile, 8:01 p.m. the next day. Later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, several bad puns later. Meanwhile, 6 hours later. Later that same evening, several days later. 6 months later, 4 to 6 weeks later.
70 years later.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
1 hour later.
1 debt to society later. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. 1 hour later. 7 hours later. 1 pair of pants later. 298 frozen patties later. 3 hours later. The next day. 10 seconds later. 346 minutes later. Much later. 3 days later. Opening night later. 3,000 years later.
A few minutes later.
1 week later. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 2 hours later. 3 days later.
1 hour later.
Several months later. Thousands of tears later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 2 hours later. Much later. Yesterday.
5 million years later.
Many hours later. 1 extremely annoying shift later. 1 winner later. Meanwhile, later. Just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Approximately 10 hours later. A lot of boring math later. 72 hours later. 2 hours later. Just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning.